And sir, before you sit down, if you'll raise your right hand for me. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Go ahead and have a seat. And doctor, if you can get just as close to the microphone as is reasonable. And Mr. Praley, you may proceed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Burson.
Good afternoon.
Will you please introduce yourself to this jury, spelling your last name for the record?
My name is Michael Burson, B-U-R-S-O-N.
How are you employed?
I am the appointed Weld County coroner, and I'm also a private practice forensic pathologist.
Can you describe where you have practiced forensic pathology throughout your career?
Yes, it's been largely up in northern Colorado. I perform autopsies with a small group of forensic pathologists, and we perform those autopsies for about 25 different counties between Colorado, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska.
Can you outline your education for your position?
I have a bachelor's degree in mammalian physiology. I have a doctorate degree in physiology and pharmacology. I have postdoctoral training in cardiovascular physiology. I have a medical degree. I'm a physician. I forgot that one. I have residency training in anatomic and clinical pathology. And finally, I have fellowship training in forensic pathology.
All right. Is that it, doctor?
I think that's plenty.
Okay, thank you. Have you previously testified as an expert like you're doing today?
I have.
Can you approximate how many times?
At least 110 times.
Is that in the area of forensic pathology?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time I move to qualify Dr. Burson as an expert in forensic pathology pursuant to Rule 702 and the people's endorsement in I.
Any objection from the defense?
No, thank you.
All right, thank you. The court will accept the doctor as an expert in the proffered field, and Mr. Pralia, you can proceed accordingly.
All right. Doctor, let's start at the beginning. Can you describe what pathology is?
Pathology is essentially the study of disease.
Going one step further in your expertise, then what is forensic pathology?
Forensic pathology is a subspecialty of pathology that focuses on the medical and legal aspects of death and disease.
Describe how medical and legal then go together.
So whenever someone passes unexpectedly, there's usually a medical reason for that or possibly a legal reason for that. So forensic pathologists examine the decedent to determine the cause of death and the manner of death, so we can essentially put the story together and explain to the family, law enforcement, any interested parties why the individual unexpectedly passed away.
All right. Can you describe then your day-to-day duties as it pertains to autopsies?
So day to day, I basically, unfortunately, wait for people to pass away and then get contacted by the folks that have the jurisdiction of those bodies. And then I perform autopsies to evaluate the body and determine cause and manner of death.
Can you differentiate between those two? You've used these terms a couple times now. Can you describe what cause of death would mean?
Yes. So cause of death is really what it sounds like. What caused the individual to pass away? There can be innumerable causes of death. Simple examples could be what most people know of as a heart attack. Catching pneumonia could be a cause of death. Cancer could be a cause of death. Injuries sustained during a motor vehicle crash, those injuries could be the cause of death. Experiencing a gunshot wound, that could be a cause of death. So lots of things can be the cause of death.
Can you differentiate that then with manner of death and describe the number of possibilities for that for you?
Yes. So manner of death is much more limited. In fact, we have 5 options for manner of death in Colorado. The manner of death is essentially the circumstances surrounding the death. So if we had the individual who had the heart attack or pneumonia, that's a natural disease process, so that would be a natural manner of death. If somebody had those injuries from the motor vehicle crash, Well, those injuries resulted from the motor vehicle accident, and in that case, that manner of death would be accident. If somebody was shot by another individual, then those injuries caused the death, and the circumstances surrounding those injuries would be the result of another individual, and that would be a manner of death homicide. If somebody were to take their own life by hanging, drugs, jumping off a building, all sorts of causes of death, if they did it to themselves, that manner of death would be suicide. And then finally, there's a few cases a year, roughly 3 to 5%, where despite a very thorough examination, interviewing family members and friends, looking at medical records, we just can't figure out why someone passed away. In those situations, the manner of death would be characterized as undetermined. So 5 manners of death: natural, accident, homicide, suicide, and undetermined.
Thank you. Sir, you described performing autopsies on a daily basis, and then you just referenced this thorough examination. Is that what you're referring to in an autopsy?
Yes.
Can you outline the process of an autopsy in describing its thoroughness to ultimately determine your cause and manner that you discussed?
Yes. So an autopsy is really what most people are familiar with from television, but it's a very systematic, layered examination of the body. By layered, I mean I approach a decedent and start at the surface layer. I document and characterize how they were received with respect to clothing, medical intervention, any obvious marks or scars, just whatever is on the surface. And then I'll go layer by layer examining the tissues. I reflect the skin and look at the bony structures. What I'm really trying to do is get down to that foundation of pathology, disease states or abnormalities. So I'm trying to characterize any abnormalities I see as I go layer by layer to come to that final conclusion of what caused the death. So after I look at the bony structures, I'll remove those and expose the internal organs. Again, looking for anything abnormal. I'll remove each organ individually and examine it such that I've looked at the surface of the organ to the internal structures. So each organ is serially sectioned or cut like a loaf of bread, so I can look for any abnormalities that may be hidden within that organ. While I'm doing that, I will take a small piece of the major organs to make a microscopic slide from. So then, when it's all done, I've looked at the surface, I've looked internally through multiple layers, and then I've examined the cellular structures, looking for any abnormalities that can explain why the individual passed away. So it's very thorough and very systematic and layer by layer by layer.
Okay. And after you do that, do you actually then come to your determination?
I do.
Okay. Is the process for any autopsy pretty similar then?
It's very standardized, but there are cases where you have to deviate from the regular routine just because of what you're presented with, perhaps.
Well, for example, in a standard autopsy, would you go through a process of washing the body before you go through it?
Yes.
Do you do that in cases of arson such as this one?
It depends on the level of thermal artifacts or injuries.
Okay. And ultimately, you had talked about going through all of the organs and internal structures. That, though, would be very systematic and consistent in any autopsy.
If they were available for examination, we go through the same process, correct?
Okay. All right. I think that covers everything before we deal with what you actually did in this case.
I think so. I guess what I didn't mention is during that process, I will also collect body fluids if they're available. So I'll collect urine, blood, fluid from the eyes if it's available, so I can then do extra testing like toxicology testing or chemistries. So again, that will be also included in the examination and used to render my final opinion.
Okay, I appreciate that. Were you the doctor who conducted the autopsy on October 4th, 2021?
In this case, yes.
Yes. And specifically, was that on Mr. Christopher Dickerson?
Yes.
Did you have to go through a process to make sure that you were identifying the correct person as Mr. Dickerson?
Well, not on that day. On that day, I was examining a John Doe.
Okay.
So the coroner's office went through the process of their identification practices to come to the final identification.
And so on the day of the autopsy, namely October 4th, 2021, you weren't certain who this person was?
Not certain, no.
Okay. Did you go through the general process and procedure that you had previously described?
Yes.
And during this autopsy process, do you have other individuals that are present at this autopsy?
Yes.
And who would those other individuals be?
Well, typically I'll have an assistant who's at the table with me doing the autopsy and collecting tissue parts. We will typically have a representative from the coroner's office or the medical legal death investigator. In cases like this, there's often representatives from law enforcement and district attorney's office.
Would those individuals be allowed from both your staff and the Greeley Police Department to take photographs and then ultimately collect items that they deemed of evidentiary value?
Yes, and that is encouraged.
Okay. If I could approach with what's been marked as People's Exhibits 149 through 170.
149 through 170?
Doctor, if you could take a moment to review those and then let me know when you're ready to proceed.
Okay.
Sir, you had stated that you write your report after the conclusion of the autopsy or at some point later, right?
Yes.
And does that contain your process and your findings?
Yes.
Does that include your opinions for cause and manner of death as well as any noteworthy injuries?
Yes.
I've handed you what's been marked as People's Exhibits 149 through 170 that you've now reviewed.
Yes.
Do you believe each of those photos and x-rays that would be contained in that they aid in the demonstration of your observations on the day of the autopsy?
Yes, certainly.
And have those been selected in part with you as well as my office and the lead investigator?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time I move for the admission of 149 through 170.
Any objection?
No, thank you.
All right. The court will admit into evidence states 149 through 170. Can the parties approach just briefly?
Yes.
of the neck. And so what we see here is, you can't tell from a picture, but physically it was a piece of metal that was sticking out of the right side of the neck. I don't know how significant it is at this point, because clearly there's going to be a lot of dirt and debris and structural stuff on the body from the fire. So this is just the first observation. As we go layer by layer, we'll start to determine whether or not it's significant.
Okay. 152.
This is just a closer up view of that feature that stood out at that time of the autopsy. Again, it's a silver colored white metal object that appears to be penetrating into the right side of the neck.
And then 153, does this demonstrate that scales are used for measurement purposes for your report as well as other things?
Yeah, just for documentation purposes.
154. Can you describe what we're looking at here, sir?
So here we've rolled the decedent up on his left shoulder just to look at the back, and we can see that, well, this is probably one of our first determinations as to the individual, because here we can see there's some preserved skin, and this is a Caucasian male. So we can see some preserved skin on the back. Likely that was protected from the fire after he had passed.
All right. Sir, I want to also discuss, as part of your process, do you take x-rays?
We do.
Okay. And why do you do that?
Again, we don't know what may have occurred with this decedent. Did he just fall down and die? Or was he shot? Does he fall down and break his neck or his arm? We don't know. So we take some x-rays to try to get any clue or evidence of what may lead us down a direction.
If we could show People's Exhibit 170.
So here we have an x-ray. It's kind of backwards. The right side should be over there, but we have an x-ray of a portion of the head and the upper chest. And this was really helps illustrate, before I start the dissection, what that metal structure may have done. And what I can tell from this image, at least from a front to back image, is that it extends at least to the midline of the neck. So the portion that we see on the surface is only a small portion of what this structure of metal may be.
You talked about then that gives you an idea for the dissection.
Yes, it just gives me not really a roadmap, but I have a sense of how far it's extending into it. So it's just further information for the procedure.
Okay. If we could show 155. Doctor, can you describe what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so we're several steps into the layered dissection at this point. And this is the neck structures after they've been removed from the body. The neck structures include what's called the larynx, which for the gentleman out there, that would be your Adam's apple, not as prominent in the females, but that's that portion of neck. Your airway and your thyroid gland area, so that front of your neck. This has been dissected out with, if you notice on your left side of the screen, which is the right side of the decedent, we still have a foreign object extending from there. So I've dissected out the neck structures, leaving that in place. So as I go through, I can document what it may or may not have injured.
Can you just orient us again, just to make it clear, the weapon that was retrieved was from the right side of the neck?
Yeah, so we're looking, imagine the decedent's head is near the ceiling and his feet are on the ground. We're looking down on the individual. So we have the right side of the body on your left, the left side on your right. You're looking down on a body. And this essentially, right here, would be the front portion of the neck, or the Adam apple area. The top portion of the airway, this is the lower portion of the trachea. So it's just been taken out in block. And this is the right side with that weapon or foreign object extending from that surface.
Thank you. Flipping that around, if we could show 156.
So now we're, like he said, we flipped it around. Now we're looking at the back side of that block of tissue. So now we can still see a foreign object extending from the right side of the neck, this time from the posterior view, and otherwise it's essentially the same. What you note here, or I note here, is in addition to that foreign object, there's a lot of hemorrhage. And we'll try to explain that as we go through here, but there's not hemorrhage from my procedure. When I dissect the body, it doesn't bleed profusely because there's no blood pressure. So here we do see a collection of hemorrhage, which is all this dark red-purple area. This area is largely void of it. It's more pink or yellow or tan, but all this dark area is tissue with hemorrhage in it.
And can you explain those concepts a little more in terms of hemorrhaging and blood pressure and how they relate as it pertains to your findings of trauma?
Sure. So when I'm going through my layered dissection, looking for abnormalities, in that process, when I cut tissue, it's going to ooze blood just because I'm cutting vessels and they're just going to leak out their contents, blood. If I encounter a tissue that is really dark, kind of like what we saw previously, that's consistent with a bruise. And a bruise is essentially damaged tissue that leaks blood while there's blood circulating, okay? If I was to take a mallet and hit a dead body, I might see a little mark on the surface from where the pressure was, but there's no bruising because I might damage the tissue, but there's no blood pressure, so blood will leak into the damaged tissue. So when I'm going through my dissection, as I encounter pockets of blood or bloody tissue, that alerts me to a possible injury that occurred during life.
Thank you. Going further in this dissection process, if we could show 157.
Okay, so we've gone through another layer, and I've actually removed the instrument. Once I found the free end in the middle of the neck, I was able to separate out the tissues affected. And what we have here, this is still on your left side of the screen is still the dominant neck structure, the larynx and trachea. On the right side of the screen is a portion of the esophagus, which resides on the posterior most portion of those neck structures. And what we have here is the final removed foreign object or weapon. We see that it has one sharp end, which we know was extending from the right side of the neck because that was in place at the time we received the body. And then it has a more blunted end, which I found into the esophagus. I removed a portion of the esophagus, which we saw on the posterior aspect in the area of all that hemorrhage. The internal portion of the esophagus is this pink tan mucosa. It's relatively unremarkable or intact except for one hole in the center there. And that hole is where that end of the weapon extended into.
Doctor, I've been able to zoom in to show that. Does that assist with what you're describing?
Yeah, it's just a closer up view where we look at the inner layer of the esophagus, and then the edges essentially represent the posterior exposed area, which we saw earlier, and that's hemorrhage. So we see a defect in the esophageal wall, which I, at the time of dissection, associated with the end of that metal object.
And does all of this correspond that we've discussed right now for what was noted in your report for stab wound 1?
Yes.
Okay. Just briefly, 158.
So just another view of the portion of esophagus we've already looked at, and a closer up view focusing in on the metal object.
Okay. Is there anything else that you think needs to be described as it pertains to your report for stab wound 1?
I don't think so. I mean, stab wound, so the numbering the wounds is arbitrary. This one was the first one I looked at, so it doesn't mean it was the first one that was occurred or the last one. It's just that's how I numbered them as I examined them. So this one essentially went into the right side of the neck through one of our major strap muscles, or the muscles you can feel when you turn your head, and went through some soft tissue causing hemorrhage and came to rest, at least at my examination, within the esophagus.
And doctor, I just want to ask, I know you had briefly talked about, you label it as one, it could have been others. Ultimately, let's take gunshot wounds and remove ourselves from this for a second. If there were 10 gunshots, you can't say which one necessarily came first or which one came last, most of the time. Fair?
Typically, no, correct.
With the object being found in Mr. Dickerson's neck at the end of this, can you at least come up with a general progression as to that being the last in this case?
You could hypothesize that. It makes sense. Or was there more than one thing that was left there after the initial assault? And then
Speculation.
I'll allow the witness to answer the question.
I think hypothetically, it's the last thing that happened. It was left there. That would make sense, but I can't say scientifically that's the case. Yes.
Fair. All right. Moving on to stab wounds 2 through 4. You had noted in your autopsy report there's a collection of stab wounds involving the anterior aspect of the neck, including the larynx.
Correct.
Okay. Describe now where we're talking.
So we're still focused on just that block of tissue, the larynx. And I believe we'll see some photos that show another progression in the layered dissection where we look at the internal structures. Examining the external portion of the neck structures was really challenging because of the condition of the body. As I think you can appreciate, the internal structure of the esophagus looks pretty good. It's intact, it's preserved. It's the areas that were exposed to the heat and fire that makes it challenging. So as we go layer by layer, that's how we can come to more definitive conclusions, and that's what we'll see with the next set of stab wounds.
Okay. Dealing with, why don't we start with 161?
Okay, so here we're still looking at that same block of tissue, the neck structures, and we've cleared away some of the charred material. This is the front, the anterior aspect of the neck because it's more dry. It doesn't have that obvious hemorrhage that we've seen on the posterior side. And what we see here is this appears to be a defect, where I'm pointing here, and I believe there's a possible defect here where I'm illustrating with my forceps. So can't say for sure what's going on here. There are defects on the surface of those neck structures. And based on the layout here, I might be more on the front and left side, but I can't say for sure from this view.
162. Does this help now that this is the internal?
It does. So now we remove the esophagus from the back of the neck. We've showed you that. And then I go to the next layer, which is opening up the trachea and the larynx itself. So I've been able to actually open up from the backside the airway. And this little white structure is just a piece of plastic swab that I use to just open up the area. But what we see here is a really preserved pink tan mucosal lining of the airway, but then there are at least 3 abnormalities. These defects here just below the vocal cords shouldn't be there. The surface should all look clean and pink and tan like the rest of it. So that's how we find defects. They jump out. They don't look right. They're abnormalities. And these turned out to be individual injuries or stab wounds or sharp force injuries. And this is virtually dead center on the anterior portion of the neck.
So in terms of a spread of the injuries, are these relatively very close together?
I would say so, because if we look at the scale, from that picture, the scale is helpful. That gives us a 2 centimeter area, which is roughly, that's less than an inch. Because there's 2.5 centimeters to an inch. So that's less than a 1 inch area. So yes, close together.
And in general, all these stab wounds that you noted were in a similar area, specifically Mr. Dickerson's neck.
Correct.
Okay. Not spread out between like his torso, his chest, his neck, and his head. Fair to say?
The ones I identified, yes, were limited to the neck.
And then dealing with stab wound number 5, you had discussed that that was the left aspect of the neck with injury to the left carotid artery, marked soft tissue, and left carotid artery injuries.
Yes.
Okay. And describe then, just before we switch to it, where are we talking?
So during this layered dissection, you know, I mentioned earlier, I look for areas of hemorrhage to suggest an area of injury. So when I was doing my neck dissection, on the left side, I saw a collection of hemorrhage. So I carefully dissected those structures, and I associated that with another sharp force injury or stab wound because there was a very discrete injury to the left carotid artery, which runs along that central block of tissue that we've been looking at so carefully.
Okay. 163.
Okay, this is challenging to get perspective, but the decedent's head is on the right side. Yeah, your right side of the screen. His neck structures are in the middle. On the left side of the screen is his chest cavity. Okay, so we're focused in on the left side of the neck. And I think you can appreciate that the centermost area is very shiny, dark, red, purple. You can contrast that with the tissue just a short distance from that, it doesn't look that way. So this is another area of hemorrhage. So this is where I started focusing my attention to a careful dissection of the structures that would be of significance there. We always look at the great vessels, the jugular vein and the carotid arteries, because even small injuries to those can result in massive blood loss. So that's an area of particular interest.
164.
So here, I've gone through that careful dissection, and I've now exposed the carotid artery, which is this white, pink, white, tan tubular structure. And these are my fingers holding it up. And right here, there's a little notch or divot. That's a defect in the artery, and it's a cut. So that portion of the artery has been injured, which is largely and most likely responsible for this profuse hemorrhage in that area.
In 164, you discuss seeing that defect in the carotid artery and it being cut, and that would be a significant event from a bloodletting process. Is that fair to say that that would cause a lot of blood to come from your body?
Yes.
Okay. If that was occurring, and maybe obviously you haven't seen this in person, but would that release a lot of blood and be obvious for someone to see?
Yes.
Okay. Ultimately, in this, we can take that down. Ultimately, in this, as you went through this thorough dissection that you described, you wrote your report that you had noticed 5 separate and distinct stab wounds.
Yes.
And then also there was the retrieval of the weapon as it pertained to some of the exhibits that we previously looked at, but is there a process of going through and marking and photographing that as you went along with the process?
Yes.
Okay. If I could show 165. (166). Why do you take these photos, Doc?
Documentation.
Yep.
I mean, it's just so we have everything documented so that when something comes up a couple years later, you have a reference to refer to, not just your memory.
167.
Just a close-up of, I'm not sure if that's my hand or my assistant's hand holding it, just to look at the end that was actually within the neck structures.
168.
Close-up view of the end.
And 169.
Just a close-up view of the, maybe an identifying mark on the tool.
Okay. Doctor, after going through this entire autopsy, were you able to determine a cause of death and a manner of death?
Yes.
And what was the cause of death?
Sharp force injuries of the neck.
And what was the manner of death?
Homicide.
Going through your process of the autopsy, it was obvious to you that the decedent was found in a burning structure, right?
Yes.
Were you able to determine whether or not there were any injuries related to smoke inhalation or direct fire contact based on looking at his internal aspects?
Yes.
And what is that?
So clearly with fire and smoke, it's dirty. You have soot deposition. And one thing I tried to focus on there when we looked at the internal portion of the trachea and larynx, it was nice, clean, pink, tan. It wasn't dirty and filled with soot. So from that perspective, I concluded it was probably unlikely that he was breathing in soot-filled smoke. But then, as I mentioned earlier, during the exam, I draw body fluids, and I was able to test his blood for the presence of carbon monoxide also. And that was negligible. He had 3% carbon monoxide, which you can get if you're in a room with a smoker, or if you do smoke, it's a very low acceptable level. It does not indicate that he was breathing smoke-filled air during the fire.
Okay. And again, that was part of why you do the toxicology.
Yes.
Okay. You also noted on the toxicology that ethanol alcohol was found in Mr. Dickerson's body.
Yes.
And a lot of it, fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. 0.362 BAC?
Yes.
Okay. Was there anything about that alcohol that was in his system that was a potential cause or manner of his death?
No.
Does that change your analysis at all as to that?
No.
Does it change your opinion at all about the 5 separate and distinct stab wounds?
No.
Also, with that toxicology that was ran, was there ever the presence of THC or anything noted that you saw in there?
I'd have to look back. I don't think there was anything else significant. May I look?
Yeah, of course.
No. There was detected caffeine and nicotine and a byproduct of nicotine. So, no.
Thank you.
Thank you.